In this chapter, we're going to discuss the design of public policies for sustainable development using a holistic approach. And I will draw on my personal experience as a state secretary in the state of Amazonas. I will start with a little story because this was in 2002 and I was called in by who at the time was the candidate for governor, Eduardo Braga. He said, well, I've seen a project that you have in the field and it's a great project and I'd like to invite you to write my platform on environment. I said, thank you, but I've never done this in my life. I was a professor at the University of São Paulo at the time in forestry. And I don't know you to know if whatever I write will eventually make sense. So it's a long story, but to make it short, I ended up writing it up. He won the election, and I was invited to set up a secretary for environment. And then in the process, I said, I don't think we should have a secretary for environment only in the state of Amazonas, which is the largest state of Brazil, with 97% of forest cover, did not have one. But we shouldn't have a secretary for environment and sustainable development. And I got the political support, and we sent a proposal to enact a law to establish the secretariat, and it was eventually approved. And the motivation for having this mandate comes from my understanding that there is a big problem in sectoral policies that tend to create silos and completely separated and non-synergetic programs and projects. In order to overcome that, there are many different arrangements possible. But what we did here was to create within a secretariat a mandate to interact formally with several other policies that are critical for sustainable development. In our case, we focused on policies and programs that had to do with natural resources. So we didn't include so much areas which are completely social. But we did include first science and technology. So we had a role in making suggestions and recommendations for the Secretariat of Science and Technology to create degrees, which were eventually created for fisheries management, for forestry management, for agroecology, and others, because we visualized that there was a demand for those professionals. In science and technology, also we encourage research programs focused on forest ecology and forest inventories. Then we had a say in economic policies, which have to do with natural resources management, because there was a need for incentives, economic incentives, such as tax incentives to activities such as Brazil nuts, which used to pay high taxes, and we changed the legislation so that it had zero taxes on non-timber forest products, because those products generate, in fact, an externality to society as a whole, because forests produce a wide variety of ecosystem services. So the second one was economic policy. The third one was rural development, which is usually agriculture, and agriculture is against forests and against the environment, or not against, but on the other side of the fence, so to speak. But we had a say in agricultural policies and land use policies. Likewise, tenure. We had a say in policies related to land ownership and land tenure. And this is a big issue when we talk about forest management, because land tenure is often insecure and unclear. Another policy was education. We had a say in education policies, especially to emphasize the need for having more locally relevant education, which is usually not the case. Usually public schools teach the same curricula throughout the country and do not address specific situations where schools are located. Then we had say in energy policies, and in our case energy is mostly produced through diesel generators, which are very inefficient, very expensive, and also very pollutant. So we had a role in that too, especially in helping production of natural gas, and this was very successful. And another policy that we had a role was in mining. So mining was actually under our mandate to design mining policies for extractive industries at the state level. And finally, water resources, water use and water management. So the design of an institution like the Secretariat for Environment and Sustainable Development of Amazonas is one that I think can be an interesting reference, because it's not new to say that there's a need to integrate policies, but it's very hard to put that in practice. We need to have a focal point. It's, in my experience, not enough to say that there's a call that policies should be integrated and somebody draws a PowerPoint and put all the boxes in there and show a picture that appeared to be integrated. You have to have a focal point. There is a need of one institution and one leader of that institution who is able to see opportunities for interaction and can pursue those interactions actively. Otherwise, they simply don't happen. So I'd like to conclude this chapter by saying that it's very important to look at the implementation of SDG 15, which has, as you know, 9 targets, and each of these targets has a connection with other aspects of sustainable development. For example, take the case of gender. There are many programs that depend largely on women, and if we don't take sort of an affirmative action approach to engage women in a way that is effective and that is efficient, it simply doesn't happen. So, and the same goes for poverty issues. In order to have a healthy ecosystem, you have to have those societies that live inside or around those ecosystems well off. I heard this from Nelson Mandela, which was a privilege many years ago, and he said that if he himself was in front of the last elephant of an endangered species, he would kill that elephant without thinking twice if his family was starving. In order to protect the environment, it's essential to reduce poverty, and it's essential to improve education. It's essential to improve gender issues. It's necessary to have a holistic thinking, and this oftentimes is not the case of forestry departments, environmental secretariat, and so on. It's essential to have a broader view. So I invite you, whenever in a position to make decisions at the policy level, to make the case that the design should be more open-minded and more ambitious and more proactive in making the bridges and the connections between different sectors of government and different programs and projects within each of these secretaries, and engaging all governmental agencies in a way that create synergies so as to increase both efficiency and effectiveness of public policies.